All right, with this section here, 4.7 or 2.7, the final one on polynomial inequalities and solving them, it's very similar to solving a quadratic equation. You got to get one side set equal to 0, and so here we would end up first subtracting 4 to get x squared minus 4x minus 21 is less than or equal to 0. And then what you're going to end up having to do is factor this. And so that would be x minus 7, x plus 3, less than or equal to 0. And so then if this was an equal sign here, then you would say x equals 7 and x equals a negative 3. These values, though, are your division places. The division of the number line. And so what you need to do then is draw yourself a number line and put these on it. And so then what you have to do is pick a test value in each interval. And when you use that test value, then you have to figure out the sign of each factor and the result. Okay, so what that means is, first off, you have these two factors, x minus 7 and x plus 3. So we're going to write those down here off to the side, x minus 7, x plus 3. And then you're going to have a result. And so in our first interval here, from a negative 3 to a negative infinity, you need to pick a value somewhere, so we're going to try a negative 4. If you substitute a negative 4 into this equation, a negative 4 minus 7 is going to be a negative 11. So all we're worried about is the sign of it, so it's a negative. And when you substitute a negative 4 into x plus 3, you're still going to be negative, because a negative 4 plus 3 is a negative 1. And when you multiply, because that's what you're doing up here, is you're multiplying those two factors together. When you multiply those two things together, a negative times a negative, the result is a positive. And so then you do that again between a negative 3 and 7, and our test value we are going to use is 0. It doesn't matter which value you use in between here. You can pick whatever you want. You just can't pick a negative 3 or a positive 7. So when you substitute a 0 into x minus 7, it becomes a negative. When you substitute 0 into x plus 3, it is a positive. And so multiplying those two things together, the result is negative. And finally then, we would pick our last value over here on the other side of 7. And so we will pick 8. And at 8, 8 minus 7 is a positive. 8 plus 3 is also positive, and when you multiply, the result is positive as well. So now we are going to use these results to determine which intervals we need for our answer. Because of this being less than 0, anything that is less than 0 is a negative number. And so then we look at our results and which results are negative. That would be this one here. So this is the interval, or this is the test value that works, which means we would use the interval from a negative 3 to a positive 7. And now because it is less than or equal to, we would write our answer as a negative 3 comma 7 with a bracket on each end. Okay. Looking at another example, same thing, except here we have it's greater than or equal to 4. So the first thing we should distribute that to get 3x squared minus x and bring that over, subtract 4 is greater than or equal to 0. And then we have to try to factor it. And so there has to be 3x and x. And we could put a minus 4 here and a plus 1 there, because now when you multiply those two, you get 3x squared. That's a positive 3x, negative 4x, which gets you negative 1, and a negative 4. And so then in this case here, x is going to equal 4/3. And in that case, x is going to equal a negative 1. And so then again, draw our number line, put in our values of a negative 1 and a positive 4/3. And now we are going to write our factors over here on the side. You could make this into a table format if you want to and put lines in, but you do not need to. And then we have a result. And so our first test value we're going to try is a negative 2. When you put a negative 2 into this, that's negative minus, so there's a negative. When you put a negative 2 into x plus 1, that is going to be also negative. And when you multiply a negative and a negative, you get a positive. And so then our second test value we're going to use between a negative 1 and a positive 4/3. We will use 0 again. And if you substitute 0 into here, that's going to be a negative. Substituting 0 into x plus 1 is going to be positive. Multiplying these two things together is going to get you a negative answer. And finally, our last test value we are going to try is something bigger than 4/3, so we're going to go with, say, 4. So that is going to be 12 minus 4, which is positive, 4 plus 1, which is positive, and our result then is also positive. Now in our inequality, it's supposed to be greater than or equal to 0, which means this interval and that interval, because those things are greater than or equal to 0, are the two that we need. So we are going to be 4/3 and above, and a negative 1 and below. So we would write our answer as negative infinity to a negative 1, and that is unioned with 4/3 to infinity. One final example is if you have something where it's even there's division in it. Same concepts apply. You still have to factor everything. So here you would have x plus 5 over, and then this can be factored to x minus 3, x minus 4, less than or equal to 0. In this case, x would be a negative 5. In this case, x would be a positive 3. And in this case, x would be a positive 4. And so now we have one more number to deal with. So we have a negative 5, a positive 3, and a positive 4. And then again, we would list all the different factors. And we still have to figure out what the result is. So, picking a number on this side of a negative 5, so we would try a negative 6. When you substitute it in here, that's going to be negative, that's negative, and that's negative. Now here we're we have dividing and multiplying in it, and it doesn't matter because the same thing happens. If you take a negative and divide it by a negative, you get a positive. Well, if you take a negative times a negative, you get a positive. So that, just think of it as all multiplying even though it's not. So when you do this, your result when you have 3 negatives is going to be a negative. Second interval between a negative 5 and a positive 3, we will take 0 as our value. Substituting it into each one of these, that's going to be positive, a negative, and a negative, which means that the result is a positive. third interval is between a positive 3 and a positive 4, so we'll say 3.5. Well, 3.5 plus 5 is still positive. 3.5 minus 3 is positive, and 3.5 minus 4 is negative. And so our result in that case is going to be negative. Finally, we will take a value bigger than 4, so we will use 5. Substituting a 5 in, that would make that positive, positive, and positive. And so our result is positive. And since we have to be less than or equal to 0, the two we want would be this one and that one, which means we need to be from a negative infinity to a negative 5, and since it's less than or equal to, just bracket on the negative 5 and a parenthesis on the negative infinity, and then union that with 3 to 4, and brackets around both of those. If this was just less than, then you would have a parenthesis. Now don't forget, if you're in some problem and you do have to end up dividing by or multiplying or dividing by a negative number, then you have to switch the inequality. Otherwise, all of these problems are basically the same. Factor them, find the roots, pick some test values, check the signs, and then what happens to the result, and use the ones that fit what the inequality says to begin with. And that concludes section 2.7.